The weight of legacy. Marcus Torres stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with hands that had once assembled rifles in darkness. The scar on his right knuckle caught the morning light, a reminder of battles fought and won, but not the kind that truly mattered anymore. At 32, he'd traded his combat boots for casual sneakers, and his commanding officer's orders for the chaotic symphony of teenage voices that filled the East Side Community Center. The center's walls were a patchwork of peeling paint and dreams, much like the neighborhood itself. Marcus had grown up 3 blocks away, watching his father march off to 12-hour shifts at the steel mill, back straight and jaw set, returning home with calloused hands and silent burdens. Now, 2 decades later, the mill's skeleton still loomed over the city, a rusted monument to a different kind of masculinity. "Yo, Mr. T." The voice belonged to Ray, one of his regulars, a lanky 16-year-old with quick hands and quicker wit. "You gonna help me with that college essay, or what?" Marcus smiled, remembering his father's response when he'd announced his decision to work with at-risk youth instead of taking over the family construction business. "Real men build things," his father had said, the disappointment heavy in his voice. "They don't sit around talking about feelings." But Marcus had seen enough of the world to know better. He'd watched tough guys break down in faraway deserts, held brothers in arms as they wept over letters from home, learned that true strength often came wrapped in gentleness. The lessons of war, ironically, had taught him more about peace than all of his father's stoic silences. "Coming, Ray," he called back, grabbing his worn leather messenger bag. Inside was a dog-eared copy of Native Son, today's discussion topic for his young men's group. The book had been banned in his father's day, deemed too raw, too real. But Marcus knew his boys needed reality more than they needed protection. The center's main room was already filling up with their usual Thursday crowd. Besides Ray, there was Miguel, shoulders hunched under the weight of being his family's sole provider at 17. Jamal sat in his usual corner, headphones around his neck like armor, trying to hide the bruise his stepfather's lesson in manning up had left. And by the window, newest edition, Andrew watched everyone with the wariness of someone who'd learned trust was a luxury. They were all sons of the old masculinity, rigid, unyielding, silence mistaken for strength. But in this room, twice a week, they were learning a different way. Marcus had seen it happening, slowly but surely, like watching ice thaw in spring. "Before we start," Marcus announced, settling into the circle, "I want to tell you about something that happened to me in Afghanistan." The boys leaned forward. They always did when he shared these stories. But today's was different. "It's about the time I broke down crying in front of my entire unit." The room grew still. Even the eternal basketball bounce from the court outside seemed to pause. "See, we just lost someone," Marcus continued, his voice steady but soft. "And I've been holding it together, being the strong one, until I found his lucky compass in the mess hall. Something about that small thing, just knowing he'd never needed to find his way home again." He let the words hang there, watching understanding dawn in young eyes. "The thing is, boys, not a single one of my fellow Marines thought less of me. In fact, it was like permission had been granted. We all cried together that night, and our unit was stronger for it. Real strength isn't about not feeling. It's about feeling everything and choosing to keep going anyway." Ray's usual smirk had softened. Miguel's shoulders had lowered slightly. Jamal had removed his headphones entirely. And Andrew was looking at Marcus like he was seeing something entirely new. "So today," Marcus said, picking up the book, "we're going to talk about Bigger Thomas. About fear and anger and what happens when men aren't allowed to be human. But first, I want to hear from you. When was the last time someone told you to man up? And what did you really need in that moment?" The silence that followed wasn't the heavy silence of his childhood home. It was the silence of earth before seeds break through, full of potential, ready for growth. Marcus watched as hands slowly began to raise, voices began to speak, and new definitions of strength began to take root. Breaking the mold. The Sunday dinner table at the Torres household hadn't changed in 20 years. The same scratched oak surface, the same faded checkered tablecloth, and the same weight of unspoken words hanging in the air between father and son. Marcus watched his father methodically cut into his steak, each movement precise and controlled, just like everything else in Victor Torres's life. "There's a foreman position opening up at Richardson Construction," his father said, not looking up from his plate. "Good benefits, steady work, the kind of job a man can build a life on." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Carmen, the center's director. "Dion's in trouble. Gang initiation tonight. Need you." Marcus's hand tightened around the phone. Dion Williams was their newest kid, a 16-year-old math prodigy who could solve complex equations in his head, but couldn't see a future beyond his older brother's gang connections. "I have to go," Marcus said, standing up. "One of my kids needs help." His father's fork clattered against the plate. "Your kids? You mean those lost causes you waste your time with instead of building something real?" Marcus felt the old anger rise, but beneath it was something else. Pity. His father had never known any other way to be a man than to be hard. "They're not lost causes, Dad. They're just boys trying to figure out how to become men in a world that keeps telling them there's only one way to do it." He left before his father could respond, the screen door banging shut behind him. The drive to the east side took 10 minutes, each one filled with prayers that he wasn't too late. He found Dion exactly where he knew he would. In the alley behind Mike's Liquor, surrounded by older boys with hard eyes and harder expectations. "Dion," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the tense air. "I need your help with something at the center. Emergency with the computer lab." The gang members turned, sizing him up. Marcus kept his stance relaxed but ready, the way he'd learned in the Marines. He wasn't here for a fight, but he wouldn't back down from one either. Dion looked torn, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "I'm kind of busy, Mr. T. Too busy to help me figure out why those differential equations you were working on crashed the system." Marcus watched understanding dawn in Dion's eyes. There was no computer emergency, but there was an escape route being offered. One of the older boys stepped forward, a dragon tattoo curling up his neck. "The kid's got other commitments tonight." "The kid," Marcus said calmly, "has a full scholarship offer from MIT waiting in my office. But you're right, it's his choice." He turned to Dion. "You told me once that math makes sense because there's always a right answer. But life isn't math, Dion. Sometimes the right answer is the one that scares you the most." The alley fell silent except for the distant wail of sirens, a sound as common in their neighborhood as bird songs in others. Dion looked at the gang members, then back at Marcus. In that moment, he wasn't a potential gang member or a math prodigy. He was just a boy trying to find his way in a world of conflicting definitions of manhood. "I should probably check out that computer problem," Dion said finally, his voice quiet but firm. The dragon-tattooed man stepped closer to Dion. "Your brother won't like this. His brother can talk to me about it," Marcus said, matching the man's tone. "Dion, let's go." The walk to Marcus's car felt longer than it was. Neither of them spoke until they were 3 blocks away, the tension finally bleeding out of Dion's shoulders. "My brother's gonna be mad," Dion whispered. "Probably," Marcus agreed. "But you know what's harder than standing up to your enemies? Standing up to the people you love when they're wrong." He thought of his father, still sitting at that dinner table, clinging to his rigid definition of manhood like a lifeline. "I don't want to disappoint him," Dion said, and Marcus heard the echo of his own younger voice. "Listen to me, Dion. Real disappointment isn't failing to be who others want you to be. It's failing to be who you know you can be." They pulled up to the center, its lights a beacon in the growing darkness. "Your brother wants you to be tough, but you know what's tougher than joining a gang? Being the first person in your family to go to college. Being the one who breaks the cycle." Inside the center, Marcus led Dion to the small office where he kept the scholarship letter. As Dion read it again, his hands trembling slightly, Marcus sent a quick text to his father. "Can't make it back to dinner. Helping someone's son choose a different path." The response came quickly. "Some paths just lead to dead ends." The storm within. The first punch caught Marcus completely off guard. It wasn't the physical impact that stunned him. He'd taken harder hits in the Marines, but the sight of Jamal's father, Derek, standing in the community center's doorway, rage emanating from him like heat from a furnace. "You're the one filling my son's head with all this soft talk," Derek spat, advancing as Marcus regained his balance. Behind Derek, Jamal stood frozen, his face a mask of terror and shame. The bruise from last week had barely faded. Marcus's combat training screamed at him to counterattack, to neutralize the threat. His muscles remembered the violence, yearned for it even, but he forced his hands to stay open at his sides, even as he positioned himself between Derek and the room full of watching teenagers. "Mr. Williams," Marcus said, keeping his voice steady, "we should talk about this outside." "Talk?" Derek laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. "That's all you do here, isn't it? Talk and talk until boys forget how to be men." The words hit harder than the punch had. They echoed his father's criticisms, the whispers that had followed him when he'd chosen this path. For a moment, doubt crept in like cold water through cracks. But then he saw Ray stepping forward, fists clenched. Saw Miguel moving to stand beside him. Saw Dion pulling out his phone, already dialing. Even Andrew, usually so careful to avoid conflict, was rising from his chair. These boys, these sons of hard men, were choosing to stand with him. "You're right," Marcus said, surprising Derek into stillness. "We do talk here. We talk about pain and fear and anger. We talk about what it means to be strong enough to feel everything and still keep going. We talk about how real men protect others, not hurt them." Derek's face twisted. "You trying to say I'm not a real man?" "I'm saying there's more than one way to be one." Marcus took a deliberate step forward. "You want to show your son what a man looks like. Show him a man who can admit when he's wrong. Show him a man who's strong enough to change." The tension in the room was a living thing, coiling around them all. Marcus could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but he kept his gaze steady on Derek. This was a different kind of battlefield, but the stakes felt just as high. "Dad," Jamal's voice cracked on the word. "Please." Something flickered in Derek's eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or recognition. His raised fist trembled, then slowly lowered. The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. "This isn't over," Derek finally growled, but the fury had drained from his voice, leaving something that sounded almost like fear. He turned and stormed out, the door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His cheek throbbed where the punch had landed, but he forced a smile as he turned to face his boys. "Everyone okay?" They nodded, but their eyes were wide with a mix of concern and something else, respect, maybe, or understanding. They had just witnessed a different kind of strength than they were used to seeing. "Mr. T," Ray said, "you could have taken him." "Could have," Marcus agreed. But then what would that have proven? That the biggest fist wins. That violence is the answer. We're trying to break that cycle, remember. Later that night, after making sure Jamal had a safe place to stay and filing a report with Child Services, Marcus sat alone in his office. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his father. Probably heard about the incident. News traveled fast in their community. He touched his bruised cheek, remembering all the times he'd seen his father solve problems with his fists, had learned to do the same. The Marines had honed that instinct into a weapon. But today, choosing not to fight had required more courage than any battlefield ever had. His phone buzzed again, his father calling for the 4th time. Marcus stared at the screen, thinking about cycles of violence and the courage it takes to break them, about fathers and sons, and the legacy of pain they pass down like family heirlooms. He answered the phone. "I heard what happened," his father said, his voice gruff with emotion Marcus had rarely heard. "You didn't fight back." "No, sir. I didn't." A long pause filled the line. Then, maybe that takes a different kind of strength." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling tears threaten. "Yeah, Dad, it does." Another pause, shorter this time. "Your mother's worried about your face. Come by for dinner tomorrow." "I'll be there," Marcus said, understanding the invitation for what it was, a small crack in a lifetime of rigid masculinity, a tiny opening for something new to grow. Brotherhood. The notice came on a Tuesday morning, printed on expensive letterhead that seemed to mock the center's worn furniture and patched walls. Carmen held the paper with trembling hands as she read it aloud to Marcus. The city had sold the building to developers. They had 30 days to vacate. "They can't do this," Marcus said, but the word sounded hollow even to him. The east side was changing, gentrification creeping in like ivy through concrete cracks. Old buildings were being torn down, replaced by luxury apartments and artisanal coffee shops. Progress, they called it. When he broke the news to the boys that afternoon, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Ray kicked a chair. Miguel cursed in Spanish. Andrew retreated into himself, another safe place disappearing from his world. But it was Dion who surprised them all. "We can fight this," he said, straightening up from his usual slouch. "Legally, I mean. My cousin's studying law at State. She says sometimes these development deals aren't as solid as they look." Marcus watched as the energy in the room shifted. These boys, who had been taught all their lives that the system was against them, were suddenly thinking about working within it. "My uncle's in the Carpenters Union," Miguel offered. "They've been fighting developers downtown. Maybe they could help." "I can make a website," Andrew said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. He flushed but continued. "To tell our story. Get support." Ray jumped up. "Man, I got like 3,000 followers on TikTok. We could make this go viral." Marcus felt something expand in his chest. Pride, hope, love for these boys who were becoming men before his eyes. But he also felt fear. Hope was dangerous in their neighborhood. It had a way of turning bitter. "Before we go all in," he said carefully, "you need to understand what we're up against. These developers have money, lawyers, connections. The odds aren't in our favor." Jamal, who had been silent until now, stood up. Since the confrontation with his father, he'd been staying with his aunt, growing stronger day by day. "When are they ever?" he asked. "You taught us that being a man isn't about winning every fight. It's about choosing which ones matter and standing together even when we might lose." The words hit Marcus like a physical force. His own lessons reflected back at him through these young voices. He looked around the circle, at Ray's determined grin, Miguel's steady gaze, Andrew's nervous but resolute expression, Dion's calculating eyes, and Jamal's quiet strength. "All right," he said. "Let's do this right." The next few weeks became a blur of activity. Andrew built a website that told the center's story, not just statistics about programs and attendance, but personal narratives. Ray's social media campaign caught fire, with kids from similar centers across the country sharing their own stories. Miguel's uncle brought union organizers to meet with them, teaching them about peaceful protest and community organizing. Dion and his cousin dug through property records and zoning laws, finding irregularities in the development plan. Even Marcus's father got involved, surprising everyone by showing up one Saturday with a crew from his construction company. "Place could use some repairs," he said gruffly. "Show them we're not going down without a fight." They worked through the weekend, fixing what was broken, painting what was faded, making the center shine like it hadn't in years. Marcus watched his father work alongside the boys, teaching them how to hold a hammer, how to measure twice and cut once, how to build something that would last. The community began to take notice. Local businesses donated supplies. Former members came back to help. Mothers and grandmothers brought food and shared stories about what the center had meant to their families over the generations. One evening, as they were cleaning up after another day of work, Marcus found Dion staring at a fresh coat of paint on the wall. "You know what I realized," Dion said. "This is what my brother was trying to give me with his gang. A sense of belonging, of brotherhood. He just didn't know there was another way." Marcus nodded. "Sometimes we have to build what we needed but couldn't find." "Think we'll win?" Dion asked. Marcus looked around at their transformed space, not just the physical improvements, but the spirit that now filled it. The way the boys moved with purpose, spoke with confidence, worked together with understanding. "I think," he said carefully, "we already have." That night, as Marcus locked up, he found a new message from the developers' lawyers on his desk. But for the first time since this battle began, he wasn't afraid to open it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They had built something here stronger than walls and wider than any one building could contain. They had built a brotherhood, rising together. The city council chamber was packed to overflowing. Marcus sat in the front row, surrounded by his boys, all of them wearing collared shirts and ties. Even Ray had traded his usual snapback for carefully combed hair. Behind them sat rows of community members, parents, teachers, former center members, union workers, and local business owners. Marcus felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see his father, for once not in work clothes but wearing the suit that still bore the sharp creases of store folds. Victor Torres nodded once, a gesture that contained volumes. The developers went first, presenting sleek renderings of their proposed luxury apartments. They spoke of property values and economic growth, of progress and potential. Their words were polished as their shoes, practiced as their smiles. Then it was the community's turn. One by one, they rose to speak. Andrea, who barely spoke above a whisper 3 months ago, presented their website analytics showing thousands of supporters. Miguel translated for his grandmother as she described how the center had helped raise 3 generations of their family. Ray's social media campaign videos played on the chamber screens, showing similar centers across the country standing in solidarity. Dion approached the podium with a stack of papers. "According to City Ordinance 47.3b, he began, his voice steady, "any development project affecting a community resource must undergo a public impact study." He laid out the legal arguments his cousin had helped him prepare, pointing out procedural violations in the sale. When Jamal stood up, the room grew still. "3 months ago," he said, "I was afraid of my own shadow, afraid of my father, afraid of becoming him." His voice shook slightly, but he continued, "The center taught me that real strength isn't about fear. It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to stand up for what's right." Finally, Marcus walked to the podium. He looked out at the faces before him, the council members, the developers, the community, his boys, his family, both blood and chosen. "There's been a lot of talk about value today," he began. "Property values, investment potential, economic growth. But let me tell you about a different kind of value. The value of a place where boys learn to become men without violence, where strength is measured not by how hard you can hit, but by how steady you can stand for others, where brotherhood means building each other up instead of tearing others down." He gestured to his group. "Look at these young men. 3 months ago, they thought their only options were to fight or flee. Now they're citing legal codes, organizing communities, creating media campaigns. They're not just saving a building. They're showing us all a new way to be strong." Marcus pulled out one final document. "We've secured nonprofit status. We've raised enough money through donations and pledges to make an offer to purchase the building outright. We've developed programs that can be replicated in other communities. The choice before you isn't between progress and preservation. It's about what kind of progress we want to create." The chamber erupted in applause. Even some council members were nodding. The developers huddled with their lawyers, faces grim. Hours later, after the council had voted to suspend the sale and review their proposal, after the celebrations had died down, Marcus found himself back at the center. His father was there, along with the boys, all of them still buzzing with victory. "You know what this means," Victor said, looking around at the space he'd helped rebuild. "Real work's just beginning." "That's what real men do, right?" Marcus smiled. "Build things that last." His father's eyes were suspiciously bright. "Yeah, guess they do." Ray called out from across the room, where they were already planning improvements. "Yo, Mr. T, you think we could start a podcast? Share what we've learned with other centers. We could help other communities organize," Dion added. "I got all these legal notes now." "Maybe start a mentorship program," Miguel suggested. "For younger kids." Andrew was already sketching a new website design. "We could create a network, connect centers across the country." Jamal, who had been quiet, finally spoke. "We could show them all what real strength looks like." Marcus looked at these young men, no longer boys, and saw the future they were building. A future where masculinity wasn't a cage but a bridge, where strength meant lifting others up, where brotherhood transcended blood and background. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We can do all of that. Together."